Meanwhile, just into our newsroom, police have issued arrest warrants for a suspect in the death of a transgender woman. Darius Mills is accused of killing 37-year-old Ashley Burton. You might remember her story. She was found shot and killed at an apartment complex on Fairburn Road in April. Mills was being held for another crime when police secured the warrants for his arrest in Burton's death. He's facing several charges now, including murder and armed robbery.
What's up, shawty? We all in Atlanta and shit. Come on. Come on. What's up? We at ATL, just left a party. How was the party, Ash?
Was great.
At 4:30 a.m. on April 11th, 2023, the stillness of an Atlanta apartment complex was ripped apart by piercing screams. A woman, blood streaming down her face, ran frantically through the dim hallways. She pounded on doors, begging anyone to let her in, her desperate cries echoing off the walls. That woman was 37-year-old Ashley Burton, a gifted hairstylist who, just weeks earlier, had been celebrating her birthday surrounded by laughter and friends who cherished her. Now she was trapped in a nightmare, fighting for her life against the very person she had once trusted most. The man chasing her wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He wasn't some random predator. He was someone she had invited into her home, her circle, her heart, a man carrying a violent criminal past she likely never knew about. By the time gunfire erupted in those early morning hours, silencing Ashley's desperate struggle, her chance at survival was already gone. To understand the weight of what happened, we need to step back. Because before she was a crime scene, Ashley was a daughter, a cousin, a hairstylist, a makeup artist, and a woman determined to live her life fully and openly. Ashley Burton grew up in South Carolina, one of several siblings in a family that loved her but also watched her navigate challenges most people never have to face. From a young age, Ashley knew who she was. Her brother Patrick later explained that Ashley never hid her identity. "The way my sibling moved in life," he said, "it was like, this is how I am. You can respect it or neglect it, but Ashley put it out there. It wasn't going to be a secret." That honesty defined her. But honesty, for a black transgender woman in the South, came with risk. Every day meant confronting stares, prejudice, and doors that quietly closed when opportunities should have opened. Yet Ashley found her power in beauty. She became a hairstylist and a makeup artist, someone who could transform how people saw themselves in the mirror. Those who sat in her chair didn't just leave with their hair styled. They left lighter, more confident, carrying a little piece of Ashley's warmth with them. Her cousin Ivory described her simply, a sweetheart, someone who laughed easily, who lit up the rooms she entered. Ashley loved fashion, loved self-expression, and loved giving people the chance to feel good in their own skin. But South Carolina was not where Ashley saw her future. She dreamed bigger. She wanted a city where she could thrive in her work and live with more freedom. That dream led her to Atlanta. Atlanta, with its reputation as a black cultural hub and its visible LGBTQ+ community, represented possibility. For Ashley, it meant a chance to build her business, expand her clientele, and live openly without apology. And in many ways, she succeeded. She began making a name for herself locally. Her clients admired not just her talent, but her personality, the way she listened, the way she made them laugh. But even in Atlanta, shadows lingered. For transgender women, especially black trans women, the risk of violence was constant. Advocacy groups had been sounding the alarm for years, calling it an epidemic. And Ashley was living in the middle of that reality, though she refused to let fear silence her. She kept working. She kept living. And that brings us back to April of 2023. Ashley's life had been filled with struggle and triumph, with beauty and resilience. But on that April morning, everything changed. Neighbors at the Elite at City Park Apartments woke to the sound of a gunshot, then silence, then the muffled chaos of footsteps. When they opened their doors even slightly, what they saw would stay with them forever. It was on the morning of April 11th, 2023, when the silence of the Elite at City Park Apartments was torn apart. The first sound was a single gunshot, sharp and unmistakable, echoing off the walls of the breezeways. For the people who lived there, it was the kind of sound that freezes you instantly. Your heart races, your ears strain, your mind asking if you really heard what you think you did. Inside her apartment, Ashley Burton had been struck in the face. Investigators would later confirm that in those final moments, she tried to fight back. She resisted giving up her phone, and that resistance was met with violence. But Ashley did not collapse immediately. Wounded, disoriented, and bleeding heavily, she forced herself toward the door. She stepped out into the open breezeway, her body carrying her only a short distance before it gave out. Neighbors would later tell police that they heard her stumble, and then the sickening sound of her collapse onto the hard concrete. Some residents cracked their doors just enough to see. Through the narrow sliver, they caught glimpses. Ashley lying motionless, blood streaked across the walkway. They closed their doors again quickly, paralyzed by fear. Whoever had fired that weapon might still be nearby. The breezeway that had once been just another walkway was transformed into a crime scene in an instant. The faint morning light revealed the trail of what had just happened, and the silence that followed the gunshot was almost as heavy as the sound itself. Minutes passed before the shriek of sirens cut through the stillness. Police cruisers sped into the complex, lights flashing, voices raised as officers secured the scene. They moved quickly, guns drawn, scanning for the shooter, but the person responsible was gone. Officers found Ashley in the breezeway, her body only steps from her own front door. They followed the blood trail back toward her apartment, marking the path of her desperate escape. Shell casings were recovered nearby. The scene told a story, even before witnesses were questioned. A struggle, a shot, an attempt to flee, and a collapse just short of safety. Neighbors gathered quietly behind police tape, some whispering about what they had seen, others still in shock. For many, the sight of their neighbor lying in the open air was one they would not forget. The officers worked methodically. Evidence markers went down. Photographs were taken. Witnesses were separated and questioned. The story began to take shape, but only in fragments. For Ashley's family, the phone call came as a sudden blow. Their world, too, was torn open that morning. Her cousin, Ivory Carter, later put their grief into words. Through tears, she asked, "Why her? You shot her in her house, then you followed her outside and shot her." That cry of anguish reflected what the evidence already suggested. Ashley had not only been attacked inside her own apartment, she had been pursued into the open and left to die. By the time detectives cleared the scene that morning, the questions were only beginning. Who had pulled the trigger? Why had Ashley been targeted? And what kind of person could shoot her, leave her bleeding in a breezeway, and vanish into the city? Those questions lingered long after the tape came down, haunting both her family and her community. The breezeway where Ashley collapsed was now a place of silence and sorrow, but for investigators it was also the beginning of a trail. Somewhere inside that apartment, somewhere in the evidence left behind, lay the first clues to identifying her killer. And in the days ahead, they would begin to put the pieces together. When the sun rose over the elite at City Park Apartments that April morning, the complex was already transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cut off the stairwells. Officers moved carefully through the breezeways, placing numbered markers by shell casings, tracing bloodstains that told the story of Ashley Burton's final struggle. Residents stood behind the barriers in silence, shaken by the violence that had unfolded just outside their doors. For Ashley's family, the call came with a force that shattered their world. Their vibrant daughter, their cousin, the woman they knew as a sweetheart with a laugh that filled rooms, was gone. Standing in front of cameras later, her cousin Ivory's voice broke with grief. "Why her? You shot her in her house, then you followed her outside and shot her." As detectives examined the scene, they began to notice details that suggested this was more than a random act of violence. Ashley's phone was missing. When investigators searched further, they discovered a second phone had also been taken. The theft of her belongings changed the shape of the case. This was not only a killing, it was also a robbery. Detectives turned to witnesses. Neighbors described the sound of the gunshot that jolted them awake. Some remembered hearing hurried footsteps in the breezeways. Others saw just enough through cracked doors to know that someone had fled. Bits and pieces of testimony gave police a timeline to work with. They collected surveillance footage from nearby cameras. Though the images were brief and grainy, they captured movement around the breezeways near the time of the shooting. Investigators compared that footage with descriptions from neighbors and began narrowing their focus. Then came the breakthrough. The details started to point toward a name already familiar to law enforcement: 31-year-old Darius Mills. At the time detectives connected him to the crime, he was already in custody on unrelated charges. The pieces fit together: Ashley's stolen phones, witness accounts, surveillance images, and Mills' own history of violent crime. In early June, police secured warrants charging him with murder, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. For Ashley's family, the announcement of his name brought no comfort. It provided an answer to the question of who, but it did nothing to answer why. Why was a man with a history of violence able to strike again? Why did it take her death to confront his crimes? Those questions lingered, heavy and unrelenting, long after his arrest. For her community, the charges confirmed what they feared. Ashley had not been the victim of random chance. She had been taken by violence that was both personal and preventable. And now, her case was set to move from the breezeways of an Atlanta apartment complex to the walls of a courtroom. When the warrants were finally issued in June of 2023, they spelled out the charges in stark language: murder, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The man accused of taking Ashley Burton's life, 31-year-old Darius Mills, was already sitting in jail on unrelated charges when his name was tied to her killing. For detectives, the case had moved from evidence to indictment. For Ashley's family, the announcement brought mixed emotions. On one hand, they now knew who was accused of pulling the trigger. On the other, the knowledge felt hollow. It could not bring Ashley back. It could not erase the trauma of knowing that she had been killed in her own home, then left to die only steps from her door. In the weeks after his arrest, court hearings began. Each time Mills appeared before a judge, Ashley's family was confronted with the weight of the system. They sat in benches reserved for victims' families, clutching tissues, holding hands, listening to charges read aloud that described the worst moments of Ashley's life. It was a process designed to deliver justice, but for them it felt like reliving the horror over and over. Outside the courtroom, the community responded. Vigils were held in Ashley's honor, candles flickering as friends, neighbors, and advocates spoke her name. Posters bore her photograph, a smiling woman with a warm gaze, reminding everyone that she was more than the crime that took her life. People who had sat in her stylist chair remembered her laughter. Others spoke about how she made them feel seen, how she gave them confidence. Advocacy groups pointed to Ashley's death as part of a grim pattern. Year after year, Black transgender women are killed at alarming rates across the United States. Too often, their cases go underreported, their names overlooked. Ashley's murder became part of that larger conversation, a reminder that the violence is not abstract, it is real, and it has faces and families. Her family, still deep in grief, demanded more than just a trial. They wanted recognition of the systemic failures that had allowed this to happen. Why, they asked, was a man with a history of violent crime free long enough to be accused in yet another act of brutality? Why did it take the loss of Ashley's life for his crimes to be confronted fully? As the legal process moved slowly forward, hearings, filings, motions, the weight of waiting pressed down on everyone who loved Ashley. Justice, even in its best form, is slow. For her family, every delay felt like another wound. For her community, it was a bitter reminder that justice delayed often means justice denied. Still, they gathered at vigils, lit candles, and said her name aloud. Because for them, remembering Ashley meant refusing to let her become just another statistic. She had been a daughter, a cousin, a friend, an artist. She had been alive, and her life had meaning. And as her case wound its way through the courts, one truth lingered above all. The loss of Ashley Burton was not only the story of one woman. It was the story of a community failed, a family grieving, and a society still struggling to protect its most vulnerable. As the months passed and the case against Darius Mills moved through the courts, the pain for Ashley's family remained raw. The charges were serious: murder, armed robbery, firearm possession, but even the heaviest sentence could never balance what had been lost. For them, there was no justice that could bring Ashley back. Her family spoke often about who she really was beyond the crime scene. They remembered her as the cousin who made everyone laugh at family gatherings, the friend who lifted spirits with her humor, the hairstylist who gave clients more than a look. She gave them confidence. Her brother Patrick described her honesty, how she lived without hiding who she was. That bravery, he said, was her gift and her strength. In Atlanta, vigils continued. Candles burned in her memory. Friends shared photos, videos, and stories that brought Ashley's laughter back to life, even if only for a moment. At these gatherings, her name was spoken alongside the names of other transgender women lost to violence. Together, they formed a list far too long, a list that advocates described not as isolated tragedies, but as evidence of an epidemic. For many, Ashley's death raised a question that has yet to be answered. What does safety look like for people who live at the intersections of racism, sexism, and transphobia? Why was Ashley, who had done nothing but live her life openly and honestly, left so vulnerable in the very place she should have felt most secure? Her home? Her story is more than the details of a police report. It is a reflection of a system that fails to protect the most at risk. It is a reminder that violent offenders slip through cracks that should not exist. And it is proof that statistics are never just numbers. They are lives, they are families, they are futures stolen. Ashley Burton's life mattered. She was not a statistic. She was not just a headline. She was a woman who moved to Atlanta to chase opportunity, who used her art to bring joy to others, who lived as herself without apology. And she was taken in an act of violence that should never have been possible. Her cousin Ivory's words still echo, "Why her?" It is the question that sits at the center of this case, and it is the question that will linger long after the legal system reaches its conclusion. Because the truth is, Ashley deserved more than answers after her death. She deserved protection during her life. And so we close this story not with resolution, but with remembrance. Ashley Burton should be remembered for her smile, for her kindness, for her courage to live as she was. Her story should push us to demand better, to recognize the red flags of violence, to call out the systemic failures that let danger grow unchecked, and to fight for a world where women like Ashley can live without fear. Because behind every statistic is a person, and behind every person is a family, grieving and asking why. If you've stayed with us through this story, thank you. And if you are new here, welcome to True Crime Red Flag. May your family stay safe wherever you are. Subscribe, like this video, and share it, because we reveal the warning signs that so many people ignore until it's too late.